I'm talking today about crowdsourcing and innovation, and I'm telling you a couple of things. First, it's not innovative. It produces innovation. Second, it's hard. And third, the demands that it's going to make on you are very, very hard and very demanding. Last week, 2 weeks ago, I actually saw the Nokia thing at this meeting, at the crowdsourcing conference in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And for the first time in a long, long time, I was criticized by an honest-to-God reconstructed Marxist. It was so much fun. I haven't had that happen in a long time. But it pointed, in many ways, to what I think the challenge crowdsourcing presents to us as a people, as a whole, as residents upon this earth, at this stage of industrial development, and to you, who think, maybe not anymore today, maybe you're just staying on so your employer knows that you used the money to a good extent and just didn't blow your weekend going to Disneyland, to those of you who want to use it, because that's going to be the challenge and it's going to be substantial. I start with the issue of it's really posing a political problem. And politics, I live in Washington. I have a very low standard of what politics is. It's about balance. It's about preventing blood in the street. I have no problems with Congress because anarchy in the streets is something I don't like. Having them yell in their little white building up at the top of the hill is fine. But the issue is when you change a little bit of that, and at some level in American politics we have seen that over the last 2 decades, the system is out of joint and needs to correct itself. We put new weights on how we think, our fundamental assumptions, the ideas we have, the things we hold dear. And giving up those things are very, very hard. And crowdsourcing as a means of production, as a means of organizing and coordinating human activity, makes that kind of demands upon you and upon us as a whole. We throw out all sorts of good ideas. It's going to democratize something without actually asking, what is democracy and is it good? We say that it's going to open up things, whereas it may have functioned better in a closed structure. And it demands that we think in new ways. Now, the second thing I'm going to be telling you is that none of this stuff is new. In fact, crowdsourcing appears as a phenomena whenever the global economy goes bad, or there is some other issue. For example, there was a discussion earlier today about crowd innovation and how it is more than a suggestion box. In fact, suggestion boxes used to be more than just a suggestion box. There used to be a theory of suggestion boxes. There was a professional association for suggestion boxes, which claimed to be one of the largest international professional societies in the country, in the world, dealing with management issues. And we have forgotten it all. We have forgotten William Henry Leffingwell, who did a lot of work defining what crowdsourcing was, who died in 1952. Charles Babbage wrote extensively on the one problem that we have heard mentioned several times here. How do you do error-free work, or how do you do at least good work, or work that has a minimal amount of errors? And he wrote that in 1831. This era has parallels with a lot of other eras in the United States, and I think helps put what you're doing in perspective. The 1920s we think of as the Roaring '20s. In fact, it was the automotive '20s. The American economy grew rapidly from a number of reasons, but the big industry, the fancy industry, the one where all the cool people, that is to say yourselves, or at least the yourselves you would like to think that you self are going to be, went into automobiles. It had one brand new form of production, the assembly line, Henry Ford, 1910. People looked at this and said, how do we use it? How can we engage it? Lots of industries tried to, and a number of them failed. Some of them did use it. Some of them used it in modified form. But more importantly, the way the auto industry used it had ramifications that spread out across world industry, which at that point was largely the US, Germany and European as it was retooling, and also Japan as it was getting through the Taisho period. But in particular, it looked at standards, standardized practices, systematic processes, how you transferred ideas, and that became a standard part. And it led to that part of the world and that part of the economy being the richest, most productive part for decades. A second part, which to me has always been highly relevant to crowdsourcing, has been Garmisch. Now, my bet is that none of you have ever heard of the Garmisch Conference and kind of wish that you are about to leave right now because there's this deep fear back in your head, somewhere that little gnawing sound that says, there's going to be an exam at the end of this talk, isn't there? He's going to give us a homework on this. Garmisch started the software industry. Prior to 1968, there's no such thing as software. There is. I mean, it's no different than what we have now, but no one made it, no one sold it. We were in the midst of what was called the programmer crisis, because everyone who bought a computer, and buy them they did, needed to have programmers to program it so it would do something. Otherwise, it would just sit there. Apps, completely unheard of. The App Store, no one had an idea that that was going to be possible. And so what happens is we have a conference, we have some IBM announcements. In 1968, people start saying, we can have an industry and we can amortize the cost of developing a program across a bunch of companies. But it became not a program. It became software systems, and it became not software systems. It became means of doing business, means of coordinating lives. And we started thinking about how we use computers in different ways and how we relate to them, because we forgot about the box. Who cares? At birth, we are now apparently given rectangles of different sizes. Your parents say, oh, I think she will want a big rectangle. I think he will just want one of the little ones. And you get that rectangle for life, and that's all you have. It's the software that makes the difference. And the people who in the 1960s were the CTOs of their age, who had to deal with this, who had to think about business process engineering, thought about hardware systems, and the engineers who ran it. The people who do that for companies now have gone so far past that point that it's not even a thought in their mind. It's not something they imagine. So to understand a little bit of what crowdsourcing is doing to us, we're going to tell the story of two women, maybe three. And I have them out of order. So two women, maybe three. These are the two women. This is the first one, and I somehow have my slides out of order. Renée Lapout. None of you have heard of her. None of you really care. Renée Lapout was a French woman, lived fairly upper-class life, was spared having to live through the revolution in 1789. And in 1757, the start of crowdsourcing computed the orbit of Halley's Comet. 1757 was the first anticipated return of Halley's Comet. Halley's Comet is the first known periodic comet, the one that comes back. We knew it came back, but no one kind of was predicting it. Halley discovers it, says, I can predict when it's coming back within 2 years. In November, she sits down to do it, and it's a very hard problem, so she recruits her buddies, Alexander Clairaut and Joseph Lalande. She, as far as we can tell, is more or less in charge of it, because she has one problem that's conceptual that she has to overcome. And it's fought out for the next 6 months, especially when their computation is not that good. It's 30 days off. And that is, can computation be divided? Can you split that kind of intellectual work across multiple people and that work still be valid? That was not clear to her contemporaries, and was not always clear to her. And it's not that she was stupid. She was very well educated, very well read, nor that her peers were stupid, although some of them were drunk, and that's kind of the same thing. Or that they were unexperienced, or that there was something in them that didn't see it. They held to the value that computing was something one person did, and that one person, by the nature of their character, the nature of their discipline, the nature of the way they were, would guarantee its correctness. Lapout argues that it's not, and very quickly we start seeing group computation. In particular, we see the nautical almanacs, which allow organized transportation across the North Atlantic on a schedule. Prior to the mid-18th century, you send a boat off, maybe it comes back, maybe it doesn't. You don't know when it is expected because you don't expect it. Once you have an almanac, you can expect it, and that's part of the ramification that started moving forward. The second is much more embarrassing. There was this winter a thing called the Tag Challenge. It was one of these DARPA-sponsored things where make crowdsourcing work. The first one was the Red Balloon Challenge. That was 2 years ago. DARPA plopped 10 red balloons around the country and said, find them, and find them fast. And a team from MIT, led by Manuel Sobrian, won it 2 years ago. And when Tag Challenge came around, I thought about organizing something, but being a fundamentally lazy person that I am, I joined Manuel's team because I figured it would win and I would get all the neat tweets and stuff. So I joined it, And very quickly, there devolved to be a suspect. They were looking for fugitives. There were 5 fugitives around the world. One ended up being in Washington, D.C., the land of the free, the home of the brave, as we say, where I happen to reside. And this was her picture, and by the rules, she was a suspect, which is a term in ironic quotes, which meant she was an unemployed 20-something who had to spend 12 hours in the public wearing that T-shirt. And they made up stuff for her about why she was a fugitive. And so I looked at that and I thought a little bit, you know, what would you do to find this? And the team was well organized, and they put together a lot of people, and they were scouring all the famous places of Washington. They really wanted to find her on the steps of the White House and take their picture with her, or on the Capitol, or on the Washington Monument, or something like that. And I said, really, that's not the question. The question is, this is a paid worker. She's going to have to spend time in the public, and that really says to me 2 things. Coffee, shopping. She's not going to hang out in the mall. There are tourists there. It's hot. There's screaming kids. She's not going to do that. So those 2 things are out. And I thought about it for a while, and I said, well, I'm not going to go out. I have other things to do. I'm a professor. So I called my co-author and asked her to go out. I called my neighbor's kid, sent him a tweet, see if he was available. I have a student who's very active in crowdsourcing, and she immediately tweeted all her friends. And there was a dog next door. I went and I patted her. She seemed in good shape. That was my contribution, until at the end of the day, I walked down to the neighborhood Starbucks. This is the problem. I'm president of the IEEE. The Computer Society at least. I've written extensively about crowdsourcing. I've addressed these conferences all the time. What does it say when I'm the person who finds the suspect with 45 minutes to go? That it's rigged? That it's not as crowdy as it's supposed to be? It's certainly not as democratic. Heavens, I can't be a Democrat. I've been criticized by Marxists. And when the first press releases went out, they were first concentrated on that, and very quickly, much to my delight, the subject shifted, and the question became, there was another team that had hacked into Manuel's team and was stealing information, and that became much more interested, and I vanished, which was all I wanted. But it really pointed to what crowdsourcing does and how it works and what is the innovative force behind it. It's a means of combining expertise, experience, knowledge in ways that avoids some of the conventional structures of hierarchies, rules, and regulations. It's not a big change, and it will not apply to anything, just as you cannot assembly line every kind of construction, every kind of assembly, every kind of manufacture. It will change things, and that ramifications will start moving out. And the issue is, what kind of results will these qualities produce? How do they work? How will they affect your lives, the lives of the workers that you see? Well, at base, this combining mechanism, this added mechanism that's in there, is a market. Because crowdsourcing fundamentally deals, several speakers have talked about judgments and judgment markets and how many judgments they do. Human beings very rarely get things right and wrong. We're not machines. We don't have that kind of precision. We do stuff that's better or worse, or smarter or dorkier, depending on how you want to call it. And to valuate that, and that's one of the key things. We valuate as compared to validate. We use markets. Markets are always comparative. We have a situation where we have a person who's running the crowdsourcing, the crowdsourcer on one side, and the crowd on the other, or I suppose the crowdsourcans, if we're going to be academic about it. We put things to it, we see what comes up in the judgment market, and we evaluate it one of several different ways. You can set up different kinds of rules for these markets to get the standard forms, the innovation form, the contest form, the self-organized crowd form, microtasking, the kind of stuff that's e-lancing or freelance work. All of these can be organized through this common market process. And if you start looking at it carefully, the place, the context where this power is concentrated comes with the way it extends our ability to deal with information. The biggest change, of course, was the computer, which is now some almost 70 years old. And the major change, I put this up, and no one knows this picture, right? Is anyone familiar with this building? This is so sad. It's a daycare center in Princeton, New Jersey, but it used to be John von Neumann's computer lab. All of you have in your backpacks, purses, pocketbooks, and briefcases several descendants of that computer, which was designed by that man. There are computers before it. They're not the same beast. That model that he designed, he said, to break up computing, you have to have 3 parts. And you all know these parts, even if you aren't that much of a computer person. You have memory, because we all worry that we don't have enough. We have a processor, because we are concerned that we don't have anything that processes our data fast enough. And we have what's called a control unit that handles what we used to call the program, then we called the software, and now we call, you maybe have heard of this term, the app. That's what we have. Those 3 parts, that's all of what a computer is. Everything else is just sort of an addition. Crowdsourcing adds a judgment market to it. It engages people, it engages judgment, it engages things that are not deterministic. It engages things that would not have an ability of getting their information in a deterministic system. And what does this actually mean? It's a new way of distributing work, and it's a new way of engaging different skills and different qualities at the same time. And that's the point. We set up barriers to run organizations that say, you can contribute, you cannot. I teach a science policy class, and I say science is a circle. Inside the circle are keepers of the sacred flames. Outside are the teeming unwashed hordes trying to get in. Crowdsourcing breaks that down through a market mechanism. And for the worker, it means that we'll now be able to bring more workers in, that people will have opportunities they didn't have, but they'll also have threats. They'll also have the idea that their jobs are slipping away or being redefined in ways they aren't able to handle. Managers. We're now setting up new kinds of work processes that require more of that business process engineering. But once you have them, they can be saved, stored, modified, changed, just as we now save computer configurations and send them around the world and no longer need an expert there. One of my arguments, as I said, that this is nothing new. Charles Handy talked extensively about this kind of change and this forces in his 1989 book on organizations. And he noted that, as other authors have, that the expensive part becomes the knowledge of management. And that the shift comes to people who can handle it, who can keep it, who know what it is, who know how to organize it for a positive good, and more importantly, how to defend yourself against it going astray. And he had this concept he called the Shamrock organization, which had these leaves that broke off and came together. And his idea was that fundamentally that we would have labor that would get broken off and stuck back on organizations as they went along. But his idea even wasn't new. Peter Drucker, who is also someone who sadly lost from consciousness a little bit, wrote about this basic idea in 1947 with the idea of having observed World War II and how factory after factory changed the products it made, but used a common production technique to get there, and common sets of workers. And that led him to argue that we live in a knowledge-based society. And the issue is controlling knowledge, making sure you understand you have the right knowledge, and that you aren't being fooled by old ideas, old values, inefficient things that are not meeting the need of your community today. So that gives us back to our 2 women. One was an example of how you broke down ideas in the 18th century. The other one was one of how you combined unusual forms of expertise in the 21st century, and I'd like to point out that I haven't gotten my part of the prize yet, and maybe Manuel figures I'm a professor, I don't need it. But I'd like to add to that a 3rd woman, and sadly, I've said this before, I will have never given a crowdsourcing talk to date without a discussion of Gertrude Blanche, and I probably won't for several years to come. This 3rd woman, Gertrude Blanche, died in 1996 at age of 100. She ran one of the largest pre-war crowdsourcing organizations, which was this one. This is the Math Tables Project, the world's largest computing organization ever created until we had machines to do it for us. 450 people managed by market mechanisms that did calculation with, if you look closely, paper and pencil. 28 volumes of work, all the major calculations of World War II. They had actually a 2 or in some ways 3-stage process of doing it to ensure quality work, to make sure that the work got done well, that the people were trained. It's a crowdsourcing organization in everything except there's no internet. She read heavily the works of William Henry Leffingwell and adapted them to this technique. She wrote this up, and her papers have a fairly detailed discussion of how she did it, how she made it work. And of course, she finishes her work at the computer, which demands a different kind of change of thought and establishes a set of values that have permeated up to the last 10 or so years. This organization shows part of the innovation because scientists fought it. They had a syllogism that went very straightforward that said, the scientists are successful people. The poor are not successful people. Therefore, we can conclude, they said, the poor are not scientists. Therefore, the poor are not disciplined. Therefore, the poor are not clear thinkers. Therefore, the poor cannot do our calculations for us. Therefore, the money that goes to this organization, which was primarily a work relief effort, should go to us and we can give it to our students, and that would be a better use of it. They were thinking in a set of values that made sense to them. They weren't stupid. They were not ignorant of what was going on around them. They had ideas that worked for them, and they could not make those ideas broad enough to allow another group of people who they did not know, who came from backgrounds they did not understand, and certainly would not have associated with in public life, do their work for them. The human computers came from the poor, and this, as I said, started as a work relief project. My shorthand is they are blacks, women, Irish, and Jews. That was the group the scientific community resisted bringing in. But eventually it breaks down, and it's that kind of resistance that we see and that we struggle with. The issue is what's normally called refactoring. It demands new concepts and demands new ways of thinking about things, or, as I've argued in some ways, re-embracing old ways, ways that we are currently not using, currently not within our community, not within our environment. That demands flexibility, new concepts, stronger sense of organization, and a better and much broader sense of work. So if we're going back to what crowdsourcing is, it's a force that will cause you to think differently. It's a cause that will demand, a force that will demand much of you. If we use it well, and I hope very much we do use it well, it can make better business processes and hopefully better businesses. We can make them more efficient, more flexible, more innovative, producing more new things. I think it has a great opportunity to educate people and give them new skills in work. It has a way of equalizing workforces and strengthening bonds between countries. But I also know that it has other problems. This is the one guy. He kind of screws things up, Henry Wallace. He argued in 1937 that information-based organizations were good for management and good for workers. They allowed workers to make better choices. He was, at the time, Secretary of Agriculture. This is a publicity shot showing him as a man of the people. He was also about this much shy of being a Marxist. He was the most liberal person we have had elected to office in American public life. For those of you who are not aware of this, he was vice president for 4 years. The Democratic Party got so nervous about him, they kicked him out and found anybody they could who they thought would be better. That person was Harry Truman, because they knew Roosevelt was going to die. So this could have been our president. However, one of the things that happened in his lifetime was that his ideas were rapidly adopted by government and by businesses, using information to manage and to control in ways that were not seen in his early days. But by 1960, he's complaining that they have been entirely subverted by conservatives, by corporate managers, people who are intent only on greed, making money, and sucking money out of the workforce. Which leads us back to this picture. I suspect this is another one most of you don't recognize. It's a statue. It's in Grand Circus Park, downtown Detroit. It's called the Spirit of Detroit. For 80 years, Detroit was the wealthiest city in the world. Wayne County was the most wealthy county in the world. The computer industry had one of its major centers there. And that's one thing that I say, you sort of see the shock go. Computer industry was founded in Philadelphia and Detroit, Michigan. And everyone says, what? And I said, well, there's IBM in New York. Philadelphia and Detroit, neither of which are known for high technology. Detroit failed to make some of those changes. They were wedded to ideas about production, organization, management, and finance. And as we all know, it has now plummeted into the bottom list of 200 metropolitan areas in terms of wealth. It has lost population, and you can buy a city block for less than $20,000. They're lovely city blocks. I'm an ex-Detroiter. And we encourage you to go back, and of course, it's grand legacy. But that's the kind of game we're playing. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not for those who don't wish to delve in and try to understand its history, its methods, looking for not best practices as we are warned against today, but at least the lessons we have learned by trying things and screwing up. It promises to be as profound, I think, as the assembly line, as the software industry was in the 70s, and perhaps even as the introduction of the factory system, which came into being about the time of Halley's Comet in 1757. This is what you are signing on to do, and I wish you well.